So we are going to be writing equations, absolute value equations, when they give us the answers. Okay? So for example, let's say I told you, we already know that absolute value equations give us two answers, right? So let's say I told you, hey, there's an absolute value equation that gives you the answer 2 and also the answer 5. Like, could you imagine coming up with like x plus 2 equals a certain number, and maybe that'll give you the two answers, but it won't, right? That was just a guess right there on my part. So we're going to give you two answers, and you're going to have to come up with the equation that actually gives you those two answers. This equation does not, right? So that was a failed attempt right there. Okay. You guys all have this little piece of paper. I handed this out to you just now, and this is the setup, all right? This is the main part of today's notes. We're going to write down a description of how to set up your equation when they give you two answers. So on this particular example, they give us two answers, the answer x equals -2 and the answer x equals +6. So we need to find out the absolute value equation that actually gives us the two answers, x equals -2 and x equals +6. So this is what I want you guys to jot down on your little slip of notes. Write this down, please. Now, before you write it down, let's understand it. Yeah, before you write it down, let's understand it. Right here on this section, you're going to set up absolute value of x minus a certain value, but that value is the midpoint. So when I give you two answers, you have to find the midpoint, the point in the middle. Now, how are you going to find the point in the middle? By simply just counting like 1 space in, 2 spaces, 3 spaces, 4 spaces in, you end up at the point 2. So the midpoint will be 2, and out here is going to be another number, and what's that other number? It's going to be the distance from the point to the midpoint. Now you're thinking, which point? This one over here or this one over here? It doesn't matter, because if the point is in the middle, it's going to be the same exact distance. So if I go from here to here, how many units is it? 4 units. Same thing here. Okay? So we need a number in here, and that number is the midpoint. We need a number out here, and that number is the distance from the point to the midpoint. So here is our absolute value equation. Put absolute value, put x, put minus, put equals, and we said that out here we need the distance from the point to the midpoint. Anyways, what is the midpoint? That belongs right in here. 2. And what is the distance from the point to the midpoint? Ladies and gentlemen, believe it or not, this right here is the absolute value equation that produces the two answers, -2 and also +6. Now, don't take my word for it. Let's actually solve this guy and show you that you get the answers -2 and 6. So if you were to solve this, you would want to do a positive and negative situation. And of course, the positive situation would be writing it exactly the way it is without the absolute values. And the negative situation is the same exact thing, but you slap on a negative onto the right-hand side value. So that becomes a -4. And now let's solve both of them. You're going to go +2 here and +2 there. You will get x equaling 6. I'm just demonstrating how the equation that we got really does produce the two answers, -2 and 6. Over here on the other side, +2, x equals -2. So as you can see, we really did get the two answers, 6 and -2, just like we had up here, just like we had on the original number line, -2 and 6. So today's second half of lesson 2.5 is I give you some answers, and knowing those answers, you need to come up with the equation. Most of the time, I give you the equation, you have to set up your positive and negative situation and find your two answers. But this time, I'm giving you the answers on a number line, and you have to actually come up with the equation. And how do we do that? By really understanding this setup right here. It's always going to be absolute values of x minus whatever the midpoint value is. Now, the midpoint value might be positive, might be negative. Okay? The distance is always going to be positive, obviously, because distance is always positive. And it doesn't matter which point you're using, they're both going to be the same distance to the midpoint. Let's try a couple of more from yesterday's homework. Everybody take out yesterday's homework, WSPM 2.5. Now, on yesterday's homework, we did 1 through 10, and I told you to hold off on the last 4 questions, 11 through 14. And that is because I wanted to do this little mini lesson separately. So let's do this. If you go down to the last 4 that we did not do yesterday, let's use that as practice on writing equations when they give us the 2 answers. All right? So let's zoom in on number 11, and I cut out the notes. You guys have it right there in your notebooks. It says the setup. Okay, the setup is this. Write down absolute value. Inside the absolute value, write x minus, leave a blank spot, and then close the absolute value, put the equal sign out there, and then leave a blank spot on the right side. All we need to do is identify the midpoint and also the distance from the point to the midpoint. Okay? So if we do have our 2 answers right here at -1 and at +1, what is the midpoint? 0. Right here is the midpoint, right? So you're going to actually write a 0 right in there. Now, how about the distance? What's the distance from the point to the midpoint? 1 unit, right? If you're right here at this value and you go here, it's only 1 unit that you're traveling the distance. So the outside value is equal to 1. And that's it. The only thing you could do is make it look nicer. And how could you make it look nicer? The absolute value of what? X. You don't need the x minus 0. You already know that x minus 0 is just x. Just like 5 minus 0 is just 5. So you really have the absolute value of x equals 1. And that's as nice of an absolute value equation that you could write. And that does really give you the 2 answers, -1 and +1. Okay? Let's try number 12. So on number 12, we have these 2 answers, -5 and -1. So we know that the setup, again, the setup from our notes, you're going to have absolute value x minus blank spot equals blank spot. Let me write that. Absolute value x minus blank spot, close absolute value, equals blank spot. Bless you. Bless you. So the question is, what is this value that I'm going to put in here, the midpoint? What is the midpoint? -3, right? -3, that is the point right in the middle. So I'm going to put a -3. And it's important that I write -3, even though there's already a minus sign, you have to write -3. Okay? And how about the distance from the point to the midpoint? 1, 2. Or if you go this way, 1, 2, right? So the distance from the point to the midpoint is really just 2. And that's your absolute value equation that'll give you your 2 answers, -2 and -1. But the easier, better looking absolute value equation would be what?
If you turn it into a positive.
Yep. Perfect. Turn into a +3 instead of the 2 -3s. Because a minus and negative changes to ++. And of course, it's still equal to 2. So this is the best absolute value equation you could write that actually produces the 2 answers, -5 and -1. Of course, if you don't believe me, you could actually set up your positive situation, your negative situation. You could solve them, and you will get the 2 answers, -5 and -1. Let's move on to number 13 right here. Number 13, we have 2 answers. The answer x equals 3 and x equals 5. What is the setup? You're going to do the absolute value of x minus something, minus the midpoint, equals something, equals the distance from the point to the midpoint. So what is the midpoint? 4. So let's put, this is the middle value right here, 4. So let's put a 4 right there in the midpoint position. And now we need the distance from the point to the midpoint. How much am I traveling? 1 unit only. So 1 unit only. And guess what? I'm done. That's it. There's nothing else I could do besides write it all in black. X minus 4 equals 1. Wait a minute. I should have said the absolute value of x minus 4 equals 1. Now, if you did set up a positive and negative situation, it really would give you the 2 answers, 3 and 5. Okay. Number 14. Answers -4, answers +4. My setup, absolute value of x minus something equals something. What is my midpoint? Cero. Cero entero. That's gross. I just recorded that. Sorry. What is the distance from a point to the midpoint? 4. So what's the best looking absolute value equation we could write? Absolute value of x equals 4. Done. And of course, the absolute value of x equals 4, if I told you to solve it, what two values would work? The positive 4 and the negative 4. So I hope this cleared it up. Yesterday we did 1 through 10. Oh yeah, let me go back to numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, because a lot of people got confused. We didn't spend too much time on them. We are not solving equations on 1, 2, 3, or 4. On numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, we are evaluating when they give you certain values. What does it mean to evaluate? To plug it in. Plug it in. So you're going to take the values that they give you and you're going to plug it in. So on number 1, you're going to take the absolute value of A. What is A according to your instructions right there? A is what? 2. A is 2. So you have the absolute value of 2 minus 5, and then you close the absolute value. Wow, that's loud. So inside the absolute values are kind of like parentheses. They're not exactly parentheses, but they're kind of like parentheses. You got to do what's inside of there first before you actually take the absolute value. So on the inside, you have 2 take away 5. What's 2 take away 5? A negative 3, but you have the absolute value of negative 3 minus 1. And what is the absolute value of negative 3? That is 3. So what is 3 minus 1? 3. The answer is 2. Now, this is not an equation that we're solving. All you're doing is plugging in some numbers, and then you're just adding and subtracting. You're just simplifying. It's not an equation. It doesn't have two sides to it. You know, you don't do the opposite. None of that stuff. It's not an equation. You're not doing a positive situation or a negative situation. 1 through 4 are just evaluating the expression. So you don't need these notes right here because we're not solving and we're not creating equations. On number 2, you'd plug in the b value. So check it out. You just absolute value. The b value is negative 3. So you plug in a negative 3 right in there. Plus 1, close absolute value, plus 8. So inside we have a negative 3 plus 1. That is a negative 2 inside the absolute value. And then plus 8 on the outside. The absolute value of negative 2 is 2. And then 2 plus 8 is 10. So your final answer for number 2 is 10. So don't get confused with the first 4. They're really easy. You just plug in the numbers and you just do the math. It's not till you get to the second part where it says solve each equation. And on these, you need to do the positive situation, the negative situation, and you solve each of them, you get 2 answers. Okay? So we're going to do another worksheet, 2.5 WSP, and it's the same exact stuff. I really hope that you guys want these questions on the quiz Friday because they're pretty easy. I mean, you're not really doing multi-step equations. They're just simple 2-step equations, sometimes 1-step equations.